The 55th session of the Senate, in the third regular session of the 16th Congress, is hereby called to order. Senator Paulo Benigno Bam Aquino IV will lead the chamber in prayer.
Let us put ourselves in the presence of our Lord. Let us pray Saint Faustina's prayer to be merciful. Lord, may the greatest of all divine attributes, that of your unfathomable mercy, pass through my heart and soul to my neighbor. Help me, O Lord, that my eyes may be merciful, so that I may never suspect or judge from appearances, but always look for what is beautiful in my neighbor's souls and come to their rescue. Help me that my ears may be merciful, so that I may give heed to my neighbor's needs and not be indifferent to their pains and moanings. Help me, O Lord, that my tongue may be merciful, so that I should never speak negatively of others, but have a word of comfort and forgiveness for all. Help me, O Lord, that my hands may be merciful and filled with good deeds, so that I may do only good to my neighbors and always try to take upon myself the more difficult and toilsome tasks. Help me, O Lord, that my feet may be merciful, so that I may hurry to assist my neighbor, overcoming my own fatigue and weariness. My true rest is in the service of my neighbor. Help me, O Lord, that my heart may be merciful, so that I myself may feel all the sufferings of my neighbor. I will refuse my heart to no one. I will be sincere, even with those who I know will abuse my kindness. And I will lock myself up in the most merciful heart of Jesus. And I will bear my own suffering in silence. May your mercy, O Lord, rest upon me. Amen.
Amen. With the permission of the chamber, the chair declares a 1-minute suspension. 11. 12 na? The session is resumed. The secretary will call the roll.
Roll call of members. The Honorable Senators Angara, Aquino, Binay, Cayetano Alan, Peter, Compañero S, Cayetano P.S., Defensor Santiago, Ejercito, Enrile, Escudero, Estrada, Gingona, Honasan, Lapid, Ligarda, Marcos, Usmeña, Pimentel, Po, Recto, Revilla, Soto, Trillanes, Villar. Senate President Drilon.
There are 12 senators present. There are 21 senators available. Oh, there are 13 senators present. With 13 senators present, the chair declares the presence of a quorum. Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I move that we dispense with the reading of the Journal of the 54th Session, Tuesday, February 2, 2016, and consider the same as approved.
Any objection? Hearing none, approved.
Mr. President, I move to consider the disagreeing provisions of Senate Bill number 2950 and House Bill number 5855.
You're referring to the Bicameral Conference Committee report?
Yes, Mr. President.
Okay. There's a motion that the chamber considers the Bicameral Conference Committee report on the disagreeing provisions of what? Senate Bill number
2951.
what?
2951.
2950 and House Bill number
2950
5855.
and House Bill number
5855.
5855. Any objection? Hearing none, consideration of the Bicameral Conference Committee report is in order.
2951.
Mr. President, I move to recognize the sponsor, Senator Coco Pimentel.
Senator Coco Pimentel is recognized.
There.
For the record, this is an act modernizing the National Bureau of Investigation.
We are filing, Mr. President, the joint explanation of the Conference Committee on the disagreeing provisions of Senate Bill number 2950 and House Bill number 5855 on the National Bureau of Investigation, Reorganization, and Modernization Act, with the attached Conference Committee report, which I hereby move to be adopted by the body and inserted into the records of the Senate. I so move, Mr. President.
The joint explanation of the Conference Committee report on the disagreeing provisions of Senate Bill 2950 and House Bill 5855 is hereby considered read into the record. There is a motion that the Chamber adopts the bicameral Conference Committee report on the disagreeing provision between Senate Bill 2950 and House Bill 5855. The Minority Leader is recognized.
Mr. President, before we dispose the issue, may I know what were the disagreeing provisions that were taken up in the bicameral Conference Committee?
Yes, it is
what were the dispositions?
Yes, the sponsor may respond and based on the joint explanation that he just submitted.
So I will just read, Your Honor, the joint explanation of the Conference Committee
Please proceed.
on the disagreeing provisions of Senate Bill number 2950 and House Bill number 5855. Number one, after having met and fully discussed the subject matter in the conference, we hereby report the following. Number one, the conferees agreed to use the Senate version as the working draft. Number two, Section 1 of the House version on short title was adopted as Section 1 of the reconciled bill. Number 3, Section 2 of the House version on declaration of policy was adopted as Section 2 of the reconciled bill. Number 4, Section 3 of the Senate version on reorganization, modernization, and expansion was adopted with the following amendments. On page 2, line 5 of the Senate version, we deleted the open-close parenthesis acronym NBI. On the same page, line 20, and page 3, line 1, we deleted the phrase Internal Audit Service, and that became Section 3 of the reconciled bill. Number 5, Section 4 of the Senate version on powers and functions was adopted as Section 4 of the reconciled bill. Number 6, Section 5 of the Senate version on jurisdiction was adopted as Section 5 of the reconciled bill. Number 7, Section 6 of the Senate version on the NBI director and other officials was adopted, but with the following amendments. On page 10, line 20, we changed the number 8 to 7. On page 11, line 2, we deleted the phrase Internal Audit Service. On line 8, we inserted the phrase or she after the word he, so we made it he or she. On lines 9 to 11, after the word Philippines, we deleted the phrase a member of the Philippine Bar with at least 15 years of relevant professional experience and preferably from within the ranks of directors, and changed this to and a member of the Philippine Bar, who has been engaged in the practice of law for at least 15 years, preferably from within the ranks of directors. On line 12, we deleted the phrase the deputy directors to assistant regional directors, and we changed this to the assistant regional directors to deputy directors. So we just reversed the phraseology. On line 16 to 19, we deleted the entire phrase and then changed this to the following. No person shall be appointed deputy director or regional director unless he or she is a citizen of the Philippines and a member of the Philippine Bar who has been engaged in the practice of law for at least 10 years for the deputy director and for at least 5 years for the regional director. So this shall now become Section 6 of the reconciled bill, which shall read as follows. I will read the entire Section 6, the new Section 6, Mr. President. Section 6, the NBI Director and other officials. The NBI shall be headed by a director and assisted by 2 deputy directors, one for administration and another for operations, and an assistant director for each of the following 7 services: Investigation Service, Intelligence Service, Human Resources and Management Service, Comptroller Service, Forensic and Scientific Research Service, Legal Service, and Information and Communications Technology Service. The NBI Director shall be appointed by the President and shall have the rank, and salary, and benefits equivalent to that of an Undersecretary. No person shall be appointed Director unless he or she is a natural-born citizen of the Philippines and a member of the Philippine Bar who has been engaged in the practice of law for at least 15 years, preferably from within the ranks of directors. The Assistant Regional Directors to Deputy Directors shall likewise be appointed by the President of the Philippines, coming from the ranks of the NBI, upon the recommendation of the Secretary of Justice. No person shall be appointed Deputy Director or Regional Director unless he or she is a citizen of the Philippines and a member of the Philippine Bar who has been engaged in the practice of law for at least 10 years for the Deputy Director and for at least 5 years for the Regional Director. Number 8, Section 7 of the Senate version on powers and functions of the Director was adopted as Section 7 of the reconciled bill. Number 9, Section 8 of the Senate version on qualifications of NBI agents was adopted as Section 8 of the reconciled bill. Number 10, Section 9 of the Senate version on powers and functions of agents was adopted as Section 9 of the reconciled bill. Number 11, Section 10 of the Senate version on benefits and privileges was adopted as Section 10 of the reconciled bill. Number 12, Section 11 of the Senate version on seminar and other professional fees was adopted as Section 11 of the reconciled bill. Number 13, Section 12 of the Senate version on franking privilege was deleted in its entirety. Number 14, Section 13 of the Senate version on retention and use of NBI clearance fees and other fees was adopted as Section 12 of the reconciled bill. Number 15, Section 14 of the Senate version on funding source was adopted as Section 13 of the reconciled bill. Number 16, Section 15 of the Senate version on implementing rules and regulations was adopted, incorporating Section 8 of the House version on deployment of NBI personnel abroad with the following amendments. On page 18, line 17, we deleted the word approval and changed this to effectivity. And we inserted the following phrase at the end of the paragraph. So Section 14 of the reconciled bill shall read as follows. Section 14, implementing rules and regulations. Within 60 days from the effectivity of this act, the NBI Director, in coordination with the Secretary of Justice and the Secretary of Budget and Management, shall promulgate such rules and regulations as may be necessary to carry out the provisions of this act. Second paragraph, within 60 days from the effectivity of this act, the Department of Foreign Affairs and the NBI shall promulgate the implementing rules and regulations on the assignment and deployment of NBI personnel to select consular posts abroad who, subject to the pertinent provisions of Republic Act Number 7157, otherwise known as the Philippine Foreign Service Act of 1991, shall perform designated duties except diplomatic and consular functions. Number 17, Section 16 of the Senate version on transitory provisions was adopted as Section 15 of the reconciled bill. Number 18, Section 17 of the Senate version on separability clause was adopted as Section 16 of the reconciled bill. Number 19, Section 18 of the Senate version on repealing clause was adopted as Section 17 of the reconciled bill. Number 19, Section 18 of the Senate version on repealing clause was adopted as Section 17 of the reconciled bill. Number 20, Section 19 of the Senate version on effectivity was adopted with the following amendments. On page 20, line 16, we inserted the phrase "in the official gazette" or "in" between the words publication and "in." So this is now the Section 18 of the reconciled bill. Section 18, effectivity. This act shall take effect 15 days after its publication in the official gazette or in 2 newspapers of general circulation. And number 21, last but not the least, the title of the House version was adopted And the measure's title now reads as follows: An act reorganizing and modernizing the National Bureau of Investigation, NBI, and providing funds therefor. This is the joint explanation, Mr. President, and I move that the Bicameral Conference Committee report be adopted and ratified.
Any objection? Hearing none. Adopted.
Mr. President, I move to consider the disagreeing provisions of the Bicameral Conference Committee report of Senate Bill number 2419 and House Bill number 640.
The consideration of the Bicameral Conference Committee report on the disagreeing provisions of Senate Bill 2419 and House Bill 6040 is in order.
Mr. President, I move to recognize Senator Coco Pimentel, the sponsor.
Senator Coco Pimentel is recognized to present the Bicameral Conference Committee report to the Chamber.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Conference Committee on the disagreeing provisions of Senate Bill number 2419 and House Bill number 6040, after having met and fully discussed the subject matter in a conference, hereby report to their respective houses that the conferees agreed to adopt the Senate version in toto. So that, Mr. President, is my report, and I move that the report be adopted and ratified by this chamber, Mr. President.
There is a motion that the Bicameral Conference Committee report on the disagreeing provisions of Senate Bill 2419 and House Bill 6040 be adopted. Senator Pimentel, in his explanation, said that the House adopted the Senate version in toto. So, any objection? Hearing none, the Bicameral Conference Committee report is adopted.
Mr. President, I move to consider the Bicameral Conference Committee report and the disagreeing provisions on Senate Bill number 2951 and House Bill number 6162.
Consideration of the
ASEP.
Bicameral Conference Committee report on the disagreeing provisions of Senate Bill 2951 and House Bill 6162 is in order.
I move to recognize the sponsor, Senator Villar. Mr.
Senator
President.
Villar is recognized.
Mr. President, the Senate panel of the Bicameral Conference on the disagreeing provisions of Senate Bill 2951 and House Bill number 6162 on the proposed extension of the Agricultural Competitiveness Enhancement Fund, or ACEP, is pleased to report the agreements reached on the matter. Essentially, the Senate version was adopted with just two changes. Number one, in Section 1, the deadline for setting aside the collection of duties for the Agricultural Competitiveness Enhancement Fund was changed from the year 2020 to 2022 as proposed in the House version. And number two, the title of the House version was adopted as the title of the reconciled bill to read as follows: An act further extending the period of implementation of the Agricultural Competitiveness Enhancement Fund, or ACEP, amending for the purpose Republic Act number 8178 as amended by Republic Act number 9496, entitled An Act Replacing Quantitative Import Restrictions on Agricultural Products except Rice with Tariffs, creating the Agricultural Competitiveness Enhancement Fund, and for other purposes. That would be all, Mr. President. May I now move that we ratify the reconciled bill as submitted, Mr. President.
Majority Leader?
Mr. President, I move to adopt the Bicameral Conference Committee report on the disagreeing provisions of the bill previously mentioned, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none, the Bicameral Conference Committee report on the disagreeing provisions of Senate Bill 2951 and House Bill 6162 is hereby adopted.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President, I move to consider the Bicameral Conference Committee report on the disagreeing provisions of Senate Bill 2947 and House Bill number 4116, Mr. President.
In order.
I move to recognize the sponsor, Senator J.V. Ejercito, Mr. President.
Senator Ejercito is recognized.
Good afternoon, Mr. President. As a result of the Bicameral Conference Committee on the Balanced Housing Act held last February 1, 2016, I have the honor to submit a copy of the Conference Committee report with a joint explanation on the disagreeing provisions of Senate Bill number 2947 and House Bill number 4116, and consider this read into the record. I move, Mr. President, that we adopt and approve the Bicameral Conference Committee report on the disagreeing provisions of Senate Bill number 2947 and House Bill number 4116. I so move, Mr. President.
Senator Sponsenrili is recognized.
So that we can appreciate, Mr. President, what was done in the bicameral conference, may I request that we take time to read in chamber the disagreeing provisions that were taken up and the dispositions.
What is the pleasure of the gentleman? Senator Ejercito will spread into the record what the Bicameral Conference Committee report agreed upon on the disagreeing provisions of the two bills.
Mr. President, if you would allow me,
Please proceed.
I would read the explanation of the Bicameral Conference Committee on the disagreeing provisions. The Bicameral Conference Committee on the disagreeing provisions of Senate Bill number 2947 and the House Bill number 4116, after having met and fully discussed the subject matter in the conference, hereby report to the respective houses the following. That, number one, the conferees agreed to use the Senate version as the working draft. On Section 2 on amendatory provisions, the House version was adopted as Section 2 in the reconciled version, and the same reads as follows. Section 3 of Republic Act number 7279 is hereby amended by redefining paragraph R to read as follows. Socialized housing refers to housing programs and projects covering houses and lots, or home lots only, or residential condominium units, undertaken by the government or the private sector for the underprivileged and homeless citizens, which shall include sites and services development, long-term financing, liberalized terms on interest payments, and such other benefits in accordance with the provisions of this Act. Number 3, still on Section 2, subparagraph B, both the Senate and House versions were adopted in the reconciled version and was rephrased to read as follows. Section 18 of Republic Act number 7279 is hereby amended to read as follows. Section 18, balanced housing development. The program shall include a system to be specified in the framework plan whereby owners and or developers of proposed subdivision and condominium projects shall be required to develop an area for socialized housing equivalent to at least 15% of the total subdivision area or total subdivision project cost, and at least 5% of condominium area or project cost at the option of the developer in accordance with the standards as provided by law, provided that the proposed socialized subdivision projects and proposed socialized condominium projects shall be exempt from this requirement. For this purpose, the Housing and Urban Development Coordinating Council and the National Economic and Development Authority shall jointly determine and set separate socialized housing price ceilings for socialized subdivision and socialized condominium projects, which shall be mandatorily reviewed or revised every 2 years. The balanced housing development, as herein required, may also be complied by the owners and or developers concerned in any of the following manner. Letter A, development of socialized housing in a new settlement. Letter B, joint venture projects for socialized housing with either the local government units or any of the following housing agencies, or with another private developer or with a non-governmental organization engaged in the provision of socialized housing and duly accredited by the Housing and Land Use Regulatory Board. But if the developer has failed to complete the development of the project, the owner and/or developer of the main subdivision or condominium project shall be solidarily liable only to the extent of compliance to the balanced housing requirements, regardless of the provisions of their joint venture agreement. Letter C, participation in a new project under the Community Mortgage Program. The Housing and Land Use Regulatory Board is hereby mandated to submit to Congress an annual report on the compliance hereof by the owners and/or developers of subdivision and condominium projects. Any person violating any provision of this section shall be imposed a fine of not less than 500,000 pesos for the first offense, suspension of license to do business for a period of 3 to 6 months, and a fine of not less than 500,000 pesos for the second offense, and cancellation of license to do business for the third offense. Number 4, still on Section 2, subparagraph C, Senate version was adopted in the reconciled version and was rephrased to read as follows. Section 20 of Republic Act Number 7279 is hereby amended to read as follows. Section 20, incentives for private sector participating in socialized housing. To encourage greater private sector participation in socialized housing and further reduce the cost of housing units for the benefit of the underprivileged and homeless, the following incentives shall be extended to the private sector. Letter A, reduction and simplification of qualification and accreditation requirements for participating private developers. Letter B, creation of one-stop offices in the different regions of the country for the processing, approval, and issuance of clearances, permits, and licenses, provided that clearances, permits, and licenses shall be issued within 90 days from the date of submission of all requirements by the participating private developers. Letter C, simplification of financing procedures. And letter D, exemption from the payment of the following. Number 1, project-related income taxes. Number 2, capital gains tax on raw lands used for the project. Number 3, value-added tax for the project contractor concerned. Number 4, transfer tax for both raw completed projects. And number 5, donor's tax for land certified by the local government units to have been donated for socialized housing purposes. Provided that a socialized housing certification issued by the Housing and Land Use Regulatory Board shall be sufficient for the purpose of availment of tax exemption. Provided further that upon application for exemption, a lien on the title of the land shall be annotated by the Register of Deeds. Provided furthermore that the socialized housing development plan has already been approved by the appropriate government agencies concerned. Provided finally that all the savings realized by virtue of this provision shall accrue in favor of the beneficiary, subject to the implementing guidelines to be issued by the Housing and Urban Development Coordinating Council. Number 5, Section 3 of the Senate version was adopted as Section 3 in the reconciled version. Still on Section 3, the word 60 were changed to 90. Sections 4, 5, and 6 of the Senate version were adopted as Sections 4, 5, and 6, respectively, in the reconciled version. And number 8, Section 6 of the House version was adopted as Section 7 in the reconciled version with some modification to read as follows. Section 7, Effectivity Clause. This act shall take effect 15 days after the completion of its publication in the Official Gazette or in a newspaper of general circulation. The title of the Senate version was adopted with some modifications to read as follows. An act strengthening the balanced housing development program, amending for the purpose Republic Act Number 7279 as amended, otherwise known as the Urban Development and Housing Act of 1992. That's all, Mr. President.
Mr. President, I move to adopt the disagreeing provisions read into the record
The
of Senate Bill 2947 and House Bill number 4116.
is there any objection? The chair hears none. The Bicameral Conference Committee report on the disagreeing provisions of Senate Bill 2947 and House Bill 4116, together with its joint explanation read into the record by Senator Ejercito, is hereby adopted.
Mr. President, I move to consider the bicameral conference committee report on the disagreeing provisions of Senate Bill number 3023 and House Bill number 6395.
Any objection? Hearing none, consideration of the bicameral conference committee report on the disagreeing provision of Senate Bill 3023 and House Bill 6395 is in order.
Mr. President, I move to recognize Senator J.V. Ejercito, the sponsor.
Senator Ejercito is recognized to present the report to the chamber.
Good afternoon again, Mr. President. As a result of the Bicameral Conference Committee on Amendments on Foreign Restrictions held last February 2, 2016, I have the honor to submit a copy of the Conference Committee report with a joint explanation on the disagreeing provisions of Senate Bill number 3023 and House Bill number 6395. And with the permission of the body, Mr. President, I'd like to read.
Please proceed.
The Conference Committee on the disagreeing provisions of Senate Bill number 3023 and House Bill number 6395, after having met and fully discussed the subject matter in a conference, hereby report to the respective houses the following. That, number 1, the conferees agreed to use the Senate version as the working draft. Number 2, on Section 1, Declaration of Policy, the first paragraph of the Senate version and the second paragraph of the House version were adopted. The second paragraph of the House version was amended to replace the word removing with amending. On Section 2, A, 2C, and 2D, these were deleted. The heading of Section 2 was rephrased to definition of investment, and House version of the definition of investment was adopted. On Section 3, the whole section was deleted and replaced with Section 3, lifting of nationality requirements. The nationality requirements for adjustment companies as provided in the Presidential Decree number 612, investment houses as provided in the Presidential Decree number 129, lending companies as provided in Republic Act number 9474, and financing companies as provided in Republic Act number 8556 are hereby repealed, subject to the provisions of this Act and the Constitution. Number 5, the Section 5 of the House version was adopted and renumbered as Section 4. Number 6, Section 7 of the House version was adopted and renumbered as Section 5. Number 7, Section 8 of the House version was adopted and renumbered as Section 6. The first proviso was amended and the phrase, and consistent with the objectives of this Act, was inserted after the word requirement. Number 8, Section 6 of the House version was adopted and renumbered as Section 7. Number 9, Section 9 of the House version was adopted and renumbered as Section 8. Number 10, Section 8 of the Senate version was adopted and renumbered as Section 9. The Section 9 of the Senate version was adopted and renumbered as Section 10. Number 12, the Section 10 of the Senate version was adopted and renumbered as Section 11. Number 13, the title of the House version was adopted and amended to read as follows. An Act amending investment restrictions in specific laws governing adjustment companies, lending companies, financing companies, and investment houses cited in the foreign investment negative list and for other purposes. That's all, Mr. President. I move for its approval.
There is a motion that the chamber adopts the bicameral conference committee report on the disagreeing provision on Senate Bill 3023 and House Bill 6395 with the joint explanation being made of record. Is there any objection? Hearing none, the bicameral conference committee report on the disagreeing provisions of Senate Bill 3023 and House Bill 6395 is adopted.
Mr. President, before we move to the reference of business, a number of matters. Firstly, we'd like to acknowledge Attorney Gil Pabilona, Head of Legal and Prosecution Service of the PDEA. He's in the plenary, Mr. President.
Attorney Gil Pabilona of PDEA is recognized.
We'd also like to acknowledge Vice Governor Bons Dolor of Mindoro, Mr. President.
Welcome to the Senate, Mr. Vice Governor.
Mr. President, the designated members, I would like to manifest that the designated members for the Bicameral Conference Committee on the disagreeing provisions of House Bill number 5076, entitled An Act Creating the Philippine Trade Representative Office and Appropriating Funds Therefor, and Senate Bill number 2922, entitled An Act creating the Philippine Trade Representative Office and appropriating funds therefore are as follows. Senator Bam Aquino as the chairperson, Senator Sani Angara, and Senator J.V. Ejercito as members.
The Senate contingent to the Bicameral Conference Committee on the disagreeing provisions of Senate Bill number
2922.
2922 and House Bill number
5076.
5076 is hereby constituted.
Mr. President, a similar matter, I would like to manifest that the Senate panel for the Bicameral Conference Committee on the disagreeing provisions of House Bill number 4730 and Senate Bill number 1618 are as follows. Senator Bam Aquino as chairperson, Senator Sani Angara, and Senator J.V. Ejercito as members.
And what is the subject matter?
This is the exact change bill, Mr. President.
Okay. Any objection? Hearing none, the Senate contingent to the Bicameral Conference Committee on Senate Bill 1618 and House Bill 4730 is hereby constituted as nominated.
Mr. President, I move that we proceed with the reference of business.
1 minute suspension. Ano?
Nancy, parang you're next. Yung centenary. Yeah, but I'll call you. Ready to resume, Mr. President.
Session is resumed.
Mr. President, I withdraw that motion.
Motion is withdrawn.
Mr. President, with the consent of the Senate, I move that we resume consideration of Senate Bill number 449 under Committee Report number 54. This is the bill on Filipino centenarians, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none, in order.
Mr. President, we are currently in the period of interpolation. Mr. President, we are currently in the period of individual amendments for this bill. I move that we recognize Senator Binay, the sponsor.
Senator Binay is recognized. Are there committee amendments, Senator Binay?
Mr. President, there are no more committee amendments nor individual amendments.
In that case, Mr. President, I move to close the period of individual amendments.
Period for amendment is hereby terminated.
I move to approve Senate Bill number 449 under Committee Report number 54, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none. Senate Bill number 449 is hereby approved on second reading.
Mr. President, I move to suspend consideration of Senate Bill number 449 under Committee Report number 54.
So suspended.
Mr. President, I move to resume consideration of House Bill number 5576 under Committee Report number 445. This is the bill on Camiguin Tourism Development, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none. Consideration of the measure is in order.
Mr. President, we are currently in the period of individual amendments. I move that we recognize the sponsor, Senator Sani Angara.
Senator Sani Angara is recognized. With the permission of the chamber, we have a 1 minute suspension.
Ready to resume, Mr. President.
Session is resumed. Senator Angara is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. I think the parliamentary status is that we closed the period of individual amendments yesterday. There are no other individual amendments, so if there are no objections, maybe can move to approve on second reading, Mr. President.
Is there any objection? Hearing none. House Bill 5576 under Committee Report 445 is approved on second reading.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Majority Leader, thank you.
Mr. President, I move to suspend consideration of House Bill number 5576 under Committee Report number 445.
So suspended.
Mr. President, I move to resume consideration of Senate Bill number 3086 under Committee Report number 352. This is the bill on the Department of Human Settlement and Urban Development, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none. Consideration of the measure is in order.
Mr. President, the parliamentary status of this measure is that the period of interpellations was already terminated, and thus I move to open the period of committee amendments and to recognize the sponsor, Senator J.V. Ejercito.
period for individual amendments is in order, and for this purpose, to receive individual amendments, if any, is the sponsor, Senator Ejercito, who is now recognized.
Committee amendments, Mr.
I'm
President.
sorry, committee amendments. Are there any committee amendments?
Yes, Mr. President. There are quite a number of committee amendments. If you may proceed.
Please proceed.
On page 2, lines 8 to 10, under section 3.
1 minute suspension. Well, sorry.
Pero yung binabayo, hindi ko.
Session is resumed. We wish to bring to the attention of the sponsor that under consideration is a substitute bill, Senate Bill number 3086. Under our rules, there can be no committee amendments, so the chair is suggesting that the amendments being proposed for the record are the individual amendments of Senator Ejercito, because technically, since this is a substitute bill, there can be no further committee amendments. So if without any objection on the part of the chamber, we terminate the period for committee amendments and now recognize Senator Ejercito on the period of individual amendments. Senator Ejercito may proceed on that basis.
Okay, thank you, Mr. President. On page 2, lines 8 to 10, under section 3, delete the whole definition of the word housing and replace it with the following: a multi-dimensional concept relating to the process of residing and the objects of dwelling whose main attributes are location, relative to access to livelihood, tenure arrangements, cost, and physical structure, as well as their environment. Housing is likewise a physical structure as well as a social structure, functioning at different spatial scales from homes, neighborhoods, communities, municipalities, cities, provinces, and regions. It is also a sector of the economy, an important category of land use in both urban and rural areas, especially in cities. It is an important factor in the overall dynamics of the urban system. I so move, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none, approved.
On page 2, line 12.
Before the chair notes that this is quite extensive amendments. To make it, to be fair to our colleagues, can the Secretariat reproduce a copy of these proposed amendments, distribute it to our members, so that they can follow the amendments being proposed? In the meantime, we have this Xerox and given to the members of the chamber. We suspend our session. The session is resumed. Upon the request of the sponsor, we can just suspend consideration of the measure while copies of the individual amendments are being reproduced, and so that we can take up other matters. On that basis, the chair is ready to receive a motion to suspend consideration of Senate Bill 3086 and the Committee Report 352. Mr. Majority Leader,
Yes, Mr. President, we move to suspend the consideration of this measure.
so suspended.
One minute suspension, Mr. President.
Suspended 1 minute.
Mr. President.
I'll call you first.
Nakalagay niya. Matatapos na ito. Ito lang, oh.
Ready to resume, Mr. President.
Session is resumed.
Mr. President, with the consent of the Senate, I move that we transfer Senate Bill number 2139 under Committee Report number 463 from the calendar for ordinary business to the calendar for special orders.
Is that already in the calendar for ordinary business? Is the Senate bill in the calendar for ordinary business? May we inquire from the Secretariat? It is not in the agenda today.
1 minute suspension, Mr. President.
It is, Miss.
1 minute suspension. Nasa Nabasa na? Gusto mo sa nabasa na. So, uulit tayo. What is the subject? Huh? Paging kopya. So, nabasa na. I just want to know.
Ready to resume, Mr. President.
Session is resumed. For the record, what is the response of the Majority Leader to the question raised by the Chair? For the record.
Yes, Mr. President, it is already in the calendar.
All right. Okay. That being so, the transfer from the calendar for ordinary business to special orders is in order and so approved.
Mr. President, I move to consider Senate Bill number 2139 under Committee Report number 463.
In order.
And may we ask the Secretary to read only the title of the measure?
Secretary will do so.
Senate Bill number 2139, an act amending certain sections of Republic Act number 4200, otherwise known as an act to prohibit and penalize wiretapping and other related violations of the privacy of communication and for other purposes.
Mr. President, I move to recognize Senator Poe to sponsor the measure.
Senator Poe is recognized.
Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, as chairperson of the Senate Committee on Public Order and Dangerous Drugs, I have the honor today to sponsor Senate Bill number 2139 under Committee Report number 463. This measure takes into consideration two Senate bills filed by Senator Honasan and this representation and the approved House Bill 6107 by Representatives Belmonte, Ferrer, Sema, Batawil, and Pagdilao. This bill seeks to amend Section 3 of Republic Act number 4200 or the anti-wiretapping law in that it exempts law enforcement agencies who are conducting illegal drug operations from the realm of anti-wiretapping law, subject still to due process. This bill, once enacted into law, will be beneficial in providing assistance to our law enforcement agencies and strengthening the government's ability to prosecute drug cases. Illegal drugs is a persisting problem in our country. According to the Dangerous Drugs Board, about 1.7 million Filipinos are engaged in illicit drugs, which represents a 200,000 increase from the number of drug users 2 years ago. However, drug syndicates have become more apparent and cunning in getting away with the law. We continue to push for legislation that will help our authorities prosecute illegal drug perpetrators. As earlier, we have passed an amendment to Section 21 of Republic Act number 9165 or the Comprehensive Dangerous Drugs Act of 2002. To support our proposal as contained in this legislation, wiretapping has been used to solve major crimes such as terrorism and drug trafficking in the United States. Wiretapping has helped establish the flow of drugs and the structure of syndicates and how they are managed from the source to the market. The heads of syndicates and financiers are not exposed during criminal activity. It is not easy to prove their participation in the trade, but recorded conversations can establish their involvement. Mr. President, I appeal to the Philippine Senate's favorable consideration in passing this measure. Patuloy po nating bigyang halaga ang nasisirang buhay at ang karagdagang buhay na maapektuhan dahil sa iligal na droga. Layunin po natin bilang mga mambabatas ang bigyang proteksyon ang ating mga mamamayan at mga pamilya laban sa iligal na droga. Maraming salamat po, Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I move to suspend consideration of Senate Bill number 2139 under Committee Report number 463.
Any objection? Hearing none. Suspended.
Mr. President, a 1-minute suspension, please.
1 minute suspension.
Ready to resume, Mr. President.
Session is resumed.
Mr. President, with the consent of the Senate, I move that we resume consideration of Senate Bill number 3209 under Committee Report number 464. This bill pertains to the proposed anti-mail order bride law, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none.
Mr. President, the parliamentary status of the measure is that the sponsor delivered her sponsorship speech last February 2. I thus move that we open the period of interpellation.
Period for interpellation is in order.
I move that we recognize Senator Pia Cayetano, Mr. President.
Senator Pia Cayetano is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, there are no reservations for interpellation. I therefore move for that we close the period of interpellation.
So terminated.
Mr. President, I move to open the period of committee amendments.
Committee amendments are in order.
Mr. President, there are no committee amendments. I therefore move to close the period of committee amendments.
Committee amendments, period for committee amendments terminated.
Mr. President, I move to open the period of individual amendments.
Period for individual amendments is in order.
Mr. President, there are no reservations for individual amendments. I therefore move to close the period of individual amendments.
So closed.
Mr. President, I move to approve this measure on second reading.
Any objection? Hearing none, Senate Bill number 3209 is approved on second reading.
Mr. President, I move to suspend consideration of Senate Bill number 3209 under Committee Report number 464.
So suspended.
Mr. President, with the consent of the Senate, I move that we resume consideration of House Bill number 2817 under Committee Report number 446.
In order.
Mr. President, I move to open the period of interpellation and to recognize Senator Pia Cayetano, the sponsor.
Senator Cayetano is recognized for the period of interpellation.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, there are no reservations for interpellation. I therefore move that we close the period for interpellations.
Period for interpellation is terminated.
Mr. President, I move to open the period of committee amendments.
Committee amendments is in order.
Mr. President, there are no committee amendments. I therefore move we close the period of committee amendment.
Period for committee amendments is closed.
I move to open the period of individual amendments, Mr. President.
Individual amendments is in order. In order.
Mr. President, there are no reservations for individual amendments. I therefore move to close the period for individual amendment.
Period for individual amendments is terminated.
I move to approve this measure on second reading, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none, House Bill number 2817 under Committee Report 446, separating the Kagasat National High School Magsaysay Annex in Barangay Magsaysay, Municipality of Cordon, Isabela, from the Kagasat National High School, converting it into an independent national high school to be known as Cordon National High School, and appropriating their funds. Therefore, is approved on second reading.
Mr. President, I move that we resume. Sorry, Mr. President. I move to suspend consideration of House Bill number 2817. Mr. President, I move that we resume consideration of House Bill number 6144 under Committee Report number 447. This is the University of Science and Technology of Southern Philippines Bill, Mr. President.
In order.
Mr. President, I move to open the period of interpellation and to recognize Senator Pia Cayetano, the sponsor.
Senator Cayetano is recognized on the period of interpellation.
Mr. President, there are no reservations for interpellation. I move that we close the period of interpellation.
Any objection? Hearing none, the period for interpellation on House Bill 6144 is hereby terminated.
Mr. President, I move to open the period of committee amendments.
Period for committee amendments is in order.
Mr. President, there are no reservations. There are no committee amendments. I therefore move to close the period of committee amendments.
Committee amendments is terminated.
I move to open the period of individual amendments, Mr. President.
Mr. President, there are no individual amendment. There are no reservations for individual amendments. I therefore move to close the period of individual amendments.
Period for amendments is terminated.
Mr. President, I move to approve this measure on second reading.
Any objection? Hearing none. House Bill 6144 is approved on second reading.
I move to suspend consideration of House Bill 6144 under Committee Report number 447.
So suspended.
Mr. President, I move to resume consideration of Senate Bill number 3204 under Committee Report number 448.
3204.
This is the basic life support training in schools, Mr. President.
Letter D. Okay. Six 144.
3204.
Saan yan? Page. Huh? Okay. Consideration of the measure is in order.
Mr. President, I move to open the period of interpellation and to recognize Senator Pia Cayetano, the sponsor.
Senator Cayetano is recognized.
Mr. President, there are no reservations for interpellation. I therefore move to close the period of interpellations.
Period for interpellation terminated.
I move to open the period of committee amendments, Mr.
Period for
President.
committee amendments are in order.
Mr. President, there are no committee amendments. I therefore move to close the period of committee amendments.
Period for committee amendments is terminated.
I move to open the period of individual amendments, Mr.
Period
President.
for individual amendments is in order.
Mr. President, there are no reservations for individual amendments. I therefore move to close the period of individual amendments.
Period for individual amendments is terminated.
Mr. President, I move to approve this measure on second reading.
Any objection? Hearing none. Senate Bill 3204 and the committee report 448, an act requiring basic education students to undergo age-appropriate basic life support training is hereby approved on second reading.
Mr. President, I move to suspend consideration of Senate Bill number 3204 under committee report number 448.
So suspended.
Mr. President, I move to resume consideration of Senate Bill number 3205 under committee report number 449.
Any objection? Hearing none. Consideration of Senate Bill number 3205 is in order.
Mr. President, I move to open the period of interpellation and to recognize Senator Pia Cayetano, the sponsor.
Senator Pia Cayetano is recognized.
Mr. President, there are no reservations for interpellation. I therefore move to close the period of interpellation.
Period for interpellation is terminated.
I move to open the period of committee amendments, Mr. President.
Period for committee amendments is in order.
Mr. President, there are no committee amendments. I therefore move to close the period of committee amendments.
Period for committee amendments is hereby terminated.
I move to open the period of individual amendments, Mr. President.
Period for individual amendments are in order. Is in order.
Mr. President, there are no reservations for individual amendments. I therefore move to close the period for individual amendments.
Period for individual amendments is hereby terminated.
Mr. President, I move to approve this measure on second reading.
Any objection? Hearing none. Senate Bill number 3205 under committee report number 449, an act mandating the integration of Filipino Muslims and indigenous peoples' history, culture, and identity in the study of Philippine history in both basic and higher education is approved.
Mr. President, I move to suspend consideration of Senate Bill number 3205.
So suspended.
Mr. President, may I ask for a 1 minute suspension.
1 minute suspension.
Ready to resume, Mr. President.
Session is resumed.
Mr. President, with the consent of the Senate, I move that we resume consideration of House Bill number 6053 under Committee Report number 429. This bill pertains to the proposed Zoe Broadcasting Inc., Mr. President.
So any objection? Hearing none, in order.
Mr. President, I move to open the period of interpellation and to recognize the sponsor, Senator Osmeña.
Senator Osmeña is recognized. On Zoe, this is the franchise granted to Zoe Broadcasting Inc. With the permission of the chamber, we suspend for 1 minute.
You have the bill, distracted driving.
Audi? Ha? Saan? Dito.
Sir.
Letter? Letter A.
Reference? Reference?
Akala ko si Sir,
So-
I know, but what is on the table now? Isn't it Zoe?
Ready to resume, Mr. President.
Session is resumed.
Mr. President, I move to proceed with a partial reference of business.
There is the Parliament, on the floor is the resumption of consideration of House Bill 6053.
Mr. President, I withdraw that motion, Mr. President.
Okay, we suspend consideration of House Bill 6053.
Mr. President, I move to approve, to proceed with a partial reference of business.
The Secretary will read the reference of business.
Committee reports. Committee report number 471 prepared submitted by the Committee on Public Services on Senate number 3211 with Senators Ejercito Estrada, Ramon Bong Revilla Jr. and Usmeña III, authors thereof, entitled an act defining and penalizing distracted driving, recommending its approval in substitution of Senate numbers 365 and 2663, taking into consideration House number 4531, sponsor Senator Usmeña III.
Referred to the calendar for ordinary business.
Committee report number 472 submitted jointly by the Committees on Energy and Cooperatives on House number 6080, introduced by Representative Bumali et al., entitled an act modifying the qualifications for and creating a streaming committee in the election or appointment of the directors and officers of electric cooperatives, amending for the purpose sections 26A and 26B of Presidential Decree number 269 as amended by Republic Act number 10531, otherwise known as the National Electrification Administration Reform Act of 2013, recommending its approval with amendments. Sponsor, Senator Usmeña III.
Calendar for ordinary business.
Committee report number 473, submitted jointly by the Committee on Health and Demography and Finance on House number 5852, introduced by Representative Badiong et al., entitled an act upgrading the WAO District Hospital in the municipality of WAO, province of Lanao del Sur, and appropriating funds, therefore amending for the purpose Republic Act number 3607, entitled an act to provide for the establishment of one general hospital in each of the municipalities of Bayang, Tamparan, and WAO, all in the province of Lanao del Sur, and to authorize the appropriating of funds, therefore recommending its approval with amendments. Sponsor, Senator Gingona III. Committee report number 474, submitted jointly by the Committees on Health and Demography and Finance and Senate number 2915, introduced by Senator Pimentel III, entitled an act upgrading the Southern Isabela General Hospital in Santiago City, province of Isabela, into a tertiary general hospital to be known as the Southern Isabela Medical Center, and appropriating funds, therefore recommending its approval without amendment, taking into consideration House number 5851, sponsor Senator Gingona III. Committee report number 475 by the Committees on Health and Demography and Finance on House number 5751, introduced by Representatives Erigel and Ortega F., entitled an act increasing the bed capacity of the Rosario District Hospital in the municipality of Rosario, province of La Union, from 25 to 50 beds, and appropriating funds, therefore recommending its approval without amendment. Senator Gingona, sponsor. Committee Report Number 476, submitted jointly by the Committees on Health and Demography and Finance on House Number 5901, introduced by Representative Relampagos, entitled an act increasing the bed capacity of the Governor Celestino Gallares Memorial Hospital in Tagbilaran City, Province of Bohol, from 225 to 526 beds, and appropriating funds, therefore recommending its approval without amendment, sponsored Senator Gingona III. And Committee Report Number 477, prepared, submitted jointly by the Committees on Health, Demography, and Finance on Senate Number 3221, with Senators Defensor Santiago, Ligarda, Ejercito Estrada, and Gingona III as authors thereof, entitled an act strengthening the human organ and tissue donation and transplantation program and providing penalties for violation thereof, amending for this purpose Republic Act Number 7170 is amended, also known as the Organ Donation Act of 1991, recommending its approval in substitution of Senate Numbers 187, 666, 1058, 2840, and 3078, taking into consideration PS Resolution Number 546 and House Number 5538, sponsor Senator Gingona III.
Calendar for ordinary business.
Mr. President, with the consent of the Senate, I move that we transfer Senate Bill number 3211 under Committee Report number 471 from the calendar for ordinary business to the calendar for special orders.
What is this?
This is the distracted driving committee report, Mr. President.
All right. Any objection? Hearing none, with the Senate Bill 3211 is transferred from the calendar for ordinary business to the calendar for special orders.
I move that we consider Senate Bill number 3211 under Committee Report number 471, Mr. President.
Consideration of the measure is in order.
With the permission of the body, I move that the Secretary read only the title of the measure.
Secretary will read the title of the measure.
Senate Number 3211, an act defining and penalizing distracted driving.
Mr. President, I move that you recognize Senator Osmeña to sponsor the measure.
Senator Osmeña is recognized to sponsor the measure.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, your Committee on Public Services is pleased to submit for the approval of this chamber Senate Bill number 3211, covered by Committee Report 471, entitled an act defining and penalizing distracted driving. This proposed measure seeks to promote responsible driving and ensure the safety of the commuting public. In doing so, the proposed measure has the following key provisions, namely: 1, prohibits the use of mobile telecommunications devices to write, send, or read a text-based communication or to make or receive calls, and 2, prohibits the use of an electronic and computing device to play games, watch movies, surf the internet, compose messages, read e-books, perform calculations, and other similar acts. The increasing use of mobile and electronic devices in our daily activities has brought with it numerous advantages. Among these advantages are an increase in productivity, better time management, and greater access to information. However, such advantages are also fraught with risks. Distracted driving is one such risk. Distracted driving is defined by the United States Center for Disease Control as driving while doing another activity that takes your attention away from driving. According to the CDC, there are 3 main types of distraction, namely: 1, visual, taking your eyes off the road; 2, manual, taking your hands off the wheel; 3, cognitive, taking your mind off the driving. A U.S. Department of Transportation study conducted in September 2009 entitled Driver Distraction in Commercial Vehicle Operations found the following. The average amount of time a driver who texts and drives takes his eyes off the road is 5 seconds. Texting while driving increases the likelihood of an accident 23 times. Dialing a cell phone increases the likelihood of an accident 6 times. The use of a calculator increases the probability of an accident 8 times. Reading a book or newspaper increases the chance of an accident 4 times. Reaching and using an electronic device such as a video camera or a two-way radio increases the likelihood of an accident by 7 times. With this in mind, Mr. President, we seek to safeguard the well-being of our citizenry and the passage of this bill is thus earnestly sought. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Osmeña. Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I move to suspend consideration of Senate Bill number 3211 under Committee Report number 471.
So suspended.
Mr. President, I move that we transfer House Bill number 6080 under Committee Report number 472 from the calendar for ordinary business to the calendar for special orders.
Any objection? Hearing none. So transferred.
Mr. President, I move that we consider House Bill number 6080 under Committee Report number 472.
Any objection? Hearing none. Consideration of the measure is in order.
I move that the Secretary read only the title of the measure.
Secretary will read the title of the measure.
House Number 6080, an act modifying the qualifications for and creating a screening committee in the election or appointment of the directors and officers of electric cooperatives, amending for the purpose sections 26A and 26B of Presidential Decree number 269 as amended by Republic Act number 1053-1, otherwise known as the National Electrification Administration Reform Act of 2013.
Mr. President, I move to recognize Senator Osmeña.
Senator Osmeña is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, esteemed colleagues, I am honored to present for the approval of the Senate House Bill number 6080 as amended by the Senate Committee on Energy. And this bill is entitled An Act Modifying the Qualifications for and Creating a Screening Committee in the Election or Appointment of the Directors and Officers of the Electric Cooperatives, amending for the purpose sections 26A and 26B of Presidential Decree 269 as amended by Republic Act 10531, otherwise known as the National Electrification Administration Reform Act of 2013, and this is covered by Committee Report 472. House Bill 6080 was introduced in the House by 55 representatives, including the Chair of the House Committee on Energy, Representative Reynaldo Umali, along with Representatives Edgardo Masongsong, Joseph Stephen Paduano as principal authors. Presidential Decree 269, also known as the National Electrification Administration Decree, was issued in 1973 to strengthen the government's electrification program by reorganizing the NEA that was earlier created by Republic Act 6038. RA 10531, or the National Electrification Administration Reform Act of 2013, further amended PD 269 by strengthening the regulatory powers of the NEA over electric cooperatives, giving the NEA the power to directly intervene in the affairs of electric co-ops through the exercise of its step-in rights and the power to appoint temporary members of the Board of Directors of electric cooperatives, among other powers. RA 10531 likewise introduced very stringent qualifications in the election and appointment of officers of electric co-ops, resulting in the disqualification of certain individuals from becoming members of the Board of Directors who otherwise would have been qualified to serve. Barangay officials are now disqualified from being elected as directors of electric cooperatives. By the nature of their positions, we believe that they are in a better position to serve the community. The proposed measure seeks to amend pertinent sections of PD 269 as amended by returning the eligibility of barangay officials to run for a seat in the Board of Directors of the electric co-ops. However, recognizing that barangay officials were in the past involved in partisan political activities to the detriment of consumers, House Bill 6080 further proposes the creation of a screening committee composed of credible members of the community that would vet the qualifications of the candidates for the said board. Specifically, House Bill 6080, as amended by Senate Committee on Energy, has the following key provisions. It disqualifies a person who holds an elective office higher than the position of barangay chair from becoming a member of the Board of Directors of an electric cooperative. It disqualifies a person or such person's spouse who has been a candidate in the last preceding local or national elections for positions higher than the barangay chair from becoming a member of the Board of Directors in an electric cooperative. It directs the Board of Directors of each electric co-op to establish a screening committee that would review the qualifications of the candidates for the said board, and said committee to be composed of the following: 1. A representative from academe as chairperson. 2. A representative from the business community who must be a member of the Philippine Chamber of Commerce and Industries. 3. A representative from the civil society based in the region. 4. A representative from the religious community within its franchise area. It further modifies the minimum qualifications of a director or officer of the electric co-op by requiring that such director or officer: 1. Be a Filipino citizen. 2. Must be able to read and write. 3. Must possess a 5-year experience in management. 4. Must be at least 21 years of age. 5. Must be of good moral character. 6. Must be a member of the electric cooperative in good standing for the last 12 months immediately preceding the election or appointment. 7. Must be an actual resident or consumer in the district to be represented for at least 2 years immediately preceding the election. 8. Must have attended at least 2 annual general membership assemblies for the last 3 years immediately preceding the election or appointment. By introducing the screening committee, we shall be improving on the purpose for which RA 10531 was passed. That is, to maximize professional management and minimize unnecessary political interference by strengthening the transparency and accountability in the election of the members of the Board of Directors of electric cooperatives. Admittedly, RA 10531 is a very recent law, and as the stakeholders have said, should be given time to be implemented before amending it. But we noted a number of problems in the electric cooperative sector that have ensued notwithstanding the good intentions of said law. And while we recognize that electric co-ops remain to be private sector initiatives, the distribution of electricity is an activity imbued with high public interest. Hence, the public remain affected by whatever problems that beset the sector. With this in mind, Mr. President, I humbly call upon my esteemed colleagues to support the immediate passage of this measure. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Osmeña.
Mr. President, I move to suspend consideration of House Bill number 6080 under Committee Report number 472.
Consideration of the measure is suspended.
1 minute suspension, Mr. President.
Suspended for 1 minute.
Committee amendments.
Ready to resume, Mr. President.
Session is resumed.
Mr. President, with the consent of the Senate, I move that we resume consideration of House Bill number 6053 under Committee Report number 429. This is the bill pertaining to the Zoe Broadcasting, Inc., Mr. President.
House Bill 6053.
53.
6053. Consideration measure is in order.
Mr. President, I move to open the period of interpellation and to recognize the sponsor, Senator Sergio Osmeña.
Senator Osmeña is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. In the interest of making things move speedily, our only amendment, committee amendment, is the withdrawal of the Senate amendment, which falls on
Mr.
page
President,
3.
Mr. President, we're still in the period of
I'm
interpellation.
sorry, this is
Period of interpellation, Mr.
interpellation.
President.
There have been no reservations to interpolate, Mr. President.
Mr. President, I move to close the period of interpellation.
So closed.
I move to open the period of committee amendments.
Are there committee amendments, Senator Osmeña?
Yes, the committee amendment, Mr. President, is to withdraw the Senate committee amendment so that this bill can
Yes, there appears to be a committee amendment on the
page
committee
3,
report,
line 18.
429. This is being withdrawn.
Yes, it's on page 3, line 18. It's the phrase "in the Philippines." I submit, Mr. President.
All right. The proposed committee amendment is not being submitted for consideration.
And that is the extent of our committee amendments.
I move to close the period of committee amendments, Mr.
Committee
President.
amendments is terminated.
I move to open the period of individual amendments, Mr. President.
There are no individual amendments.
There are no individual amendments, Mr. President.
I move to close the period of individual amendments,
So
Mr.
closed.
President. I move to approve this measure on second reading, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none. Proposed House Bill number 6053 is approved on second reading.
Mr. President, I move to suspend consideration of House Bill 6053 under
So
Committee Report
suspended.
429. Mr. President, I move that we resume consideration of House Bill number 5859 under Committee Report number 430. This is the People's Broadcasting Service, Inc., Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none. Consideration is in order.
I move to open the period of interpellations, Mr. President, and to recognize Senator Osmeña, the sponsor.
Senator Osmeña is recognized for the period of interpellation on House Bill 5859.
Thank you, Mr. President. There have been no reservations for interpellations. I move to close the period of
So
interpellation.
terminated.
Mr. President, I move to open the period of committee amendments.
Committee amendments are in order.
Mr. President, the only committee amendment would be to withdraw the amendment of the Senate on the last page, which is on line 17, page 6, to reincorporate the House amendment, which is the official Gazette in A, and to delete the committee amendment or the insertion at least 2. I submit, Mr. President.
The committee amendments found in Committee Report 430 are deemed not submitted and therefore withdrawn, and the original text will remain.
I move to close the period of committee amendments, Mr. President.
Closed.
I move to open the period of individual amendments, Mr.
And
President.
for individual amendments are in order.
Thank you, Mr. President. There have been no reservations for interpellations.
No,
No.
committee on
What are we
individual amendments. There are no individual amendments, Senator Osmeña.
No individual amendments.
So terminated.
I move to approve this measure on second reading, Mr. President.
In objection, hearing none, House Bill 5859 is hereby approved on second reading.
I move to suspend consideration on this measure, Mr.
So
President.
suspended.
Mr. President, I move to resume consideration of House Bill 6021 under Committee Report 431. This is the Pilipinas Asian Pearl Airways, Mr. President.
In order.
Mr. President, I move to open the period of interpellation and to recognize Senator Osmeña.
Senator Osmeña is recognized.
There have been no reservations to interpellate. I move to close the period of interpellations, Mr.
Period
President.
for debates terminated.
I move to open the period of committee amendments, Mr. President.
Committee amendments, if any, are in order.
Yes, we're merely reversing the committee amendment of the Senate. So therefore, that falls on page 6, line 24. I submit, Mr. President.
The chair understands that the sponsor is no longer submitting the committee amendments for the consideration of the chamber.
That is correct, Mr. President.
All right. Such being the case, the period for committee amendments is terminated.
I move to open the period of individual amendments, Mr.
Are there
President.
individual
There have
amendments, Senator
There have
Osmeña?
been no reservations to propose committee amendments. I move to close the period for individual amendments. I move to close the period for individual amendments.
So closed.
I move to approve this measure on second reading, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none. House Bill 6021 is hereby approved on second reading.
I move to suspend consideration of the measure, Mr.
So
President.
suspended.
Mr. President, I move to resume consideration of House Bill number 6011 under Committee Report number 450. This is the Veritas Media Arts Incorporated,
In order.
Mr. President. Mr. President, I move to open the period of interpellation and to recognize Senator Osmeña.
Senator Osmeña is recognized. There are no reservations for
There are no
interpellation.
reservations. May I move to close the period for debate?
So closed.
I move to open the period of committee amendments, Mr. President.
There are no committee amendments, Mr. President. I move to close the period for committee
So
amendments.
closed.
I move to open the period of individual amendments, Mr.
There have been
President.
no reservations for individual amendments. I move to close.
So closed.
Individual amendments.
Mr. President, I move to approve this measure on second reading.
Any objection? Hearing none. House Bill 6011 under Committee Report 450 is approved on second reading.
Mr. President, I move to suspend consideration of this measure.
So suspended.
Mr. President, I move to resume consideration of House Bill 5601 under Committee Report number 451.
Any objection? Hearing none. Approved.
I move to open the period of interpellation and to recognize Senator Osmeña.
Senator Osmeña is recognized.
There have been no reservations for interpellation. I move to close the period of interpellation.
Period for interpellation is terminated.
I move to open the period of committee amendments, Mr.
Committee
President.
amendments are in order, if any.
There are no committee amendments, Mr. President. I move to close the period for committee amendments.
So terminated.
I move to open the period of individual amendments, Mr. President.
Individual amendments are in order, if
There are
any.
no individual amendments, Mr. President. I move to close the period for individual
So
amendments.
closed.
I move to approve this measure on second reading, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none. House Bill 5601 is approved on second reading.
I move to suspend consideration of the measure, Mr.
So
President.
suspended.
Mr. President, I move to resume consideration of House Bill number 6005 under Committee Report 452.
In order.
I move to open the period of interpellation and to recognize Senator Osmeña, Mr.
Senator
President.
Osmeña is recognized.
There are no reservations for interpellation. I move to close the period of interpellation, Mr.
Period for
President.
interpellation is terminated.
I move to open the period of committee amendments, Mr. President.
There are no
Committee-
committee amendments, Mr. President. I move to close the period for committee amendments.
So closed.
I move to open the period of individual amendments, Mr. President.
No
Individual
reservations to make individual amendments. I move to close the period for individual amendments, Mr. President.
Mr. President, I move to approve this measure on second reading.
Any objection? Hearing none. House Bill 6005 and the committee report 450 is approved on second reading.
Mr. President, I move to suspend consideration of this measure.
So suspended.
Mr. President, I move to resume consideration of House Bill number 6193 under Committee Report number 453.
Any objection? Hearing none. Consideration of the measure is in order.
I move to open the period of interpellation and to recognize Senator Osmeña, the sponsor.
Senator Osmeña is recognized.
No reservations for interpellation. I move to close, Mr. President.
Period for interpellation is terminated.
Mr. President, I move to open the period of committee amendments.
Committee amendments are in order.
There are no committee amendments. Move to close, Mr. President.
Committee amendments terminated.
I move to open the period of individual amendments, Mr. President.
There are no individual amendments. I move to close, Mr. President.
Period for amendments is terminated.
I move to approve this measure on second reading, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none. House Bill 6193 and the committee report 453 is approved on second reading.
I move to suspend consideration of this measure, Mr.
So
President.
suspended.
Mr. President, I move to resume consideration of House Bill number 6314 under Committee Report number 454.
Any objection? Hearing none. In order.
Mr. President, I move to open the period of interpellation and to recognize Senator Osmeña, the sponsor.
Senator Osmeña is recognized. and the
There are
period
no
of
interpellations. I move to close, Mr. President.
So terminated.
I move to open the period of committee amendments, Mr. President.
There are no committee amendments, Mr. President. I move to close.
So closed.
I move to open the period of individual amendments, Mr. President.
There are no individual amendments. I move to close, Mr. President.
Closed.
Mr. President, I move to approve this measure on second reading.
Any objection? Hearing none. House Bill 6314 under committee report 454 is hereby approved on second reading.
Mr. President, I move to suspend consideration of this measure.
Consideration of the measure is suspended.
Mr. President, I move to resume consideration of House Bill number 6312 under Committee Report number 455.
Any objection? Hearing none. Consideration of the measure is in order.
I move to open the period of interpellation and to recognize the sponsor, Senator Osmeña.
Senator Osmeña is recognized on the period of interpellation.
There are no interpellations. I move to close, Mr. President.
Period for interpellation is terminated.
Mr. President, I move to open the period of committee amendments.
Committee amendments are in order.
There are no committee amendments, Mr. President. I move to close.
So close.
Mr. President, I move to open the period of individual amendments.
Individual amendments are in order.
There are no individual amendments. Move to close, Mr. President.
So closed.
Mr. President, I move to approve this measure on second reading.
Any objection? Hearing none. House Bill 6312 is hereby approved on second reading.
Mr. President, I move to suspend consideration of this measure.
So suspended.
I move to resume consideration of House Bill number 6168 under Committee Report number 457, Mr. President.
Consideration of the measure is in order.
I move to open the period of interpellation and to recognize the sponsor, Senator Osmeña.
Senator Osmeña is recognized.
There are no interpellations. Move to close, Mr. President.
Period for interpellation is terminated.
I move to open the period of committee amendments, Mr.
Committee
President.
amendments are in order.
There are no committee amendments. Move to close, Mr. President.
Period for committee amendments is terminated.
Mr. President, I move to open the period of individual amendments.
Period for individual amendments are in order.
There are no individual amendments. I move to close, Mr. President.
Period for individual amendments are terminated.
Mr. President, I move to approve this measure on second reading.
Any objection? Hearing none. House Bill 6168 under committee report 457 is hereby approved on second reading.
I move to suspend consideration of House Bill number 6168, Mr. President.
So closed.
Mr. President, I move that we resume consideration of House Bill number 2185 under Committee Report number 458.
Any objection? Hearing none, in order.
Mr. President, I move to open the period of interpellation and to recognize Senator Osmeña, the sponsor.
Senator Osmeña is recognized.
There are no reservations to interpolate. I move to close, Mr. President.
Period for interpellation is terminated.
Mr. President, I move to open the period of committee amendments.
Committee amendments are in order.
There are no committee amendments. I move to close, Mr. President.
So closed.
Mr. President, I move to open the period of individual amendments.
There are no individual amendments. Move to close, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none, so closed.
Mr. President, I move to approve this measure on second reading.
Any objection? Hearing none. House Bill 2185 under Committee Report number 458 is hereby approved on second.
Mr. President, I move to suspend consideration of this measure.
Consideration of the measure is suspended.
Mr. President, I move to resume consideration of House Bill number 6003 under Committee Report number 459.
Any objection? Hearing none. Consideration of House Bill 6003 under Committee Report 459 is in order.
I move to open the period of interpellation and to recognize Senator Osmeña, Mr. President.
Senator Osmeña is recognized.
There are no reservations to interpolate. I move to close, Mr. President.
Period for interpellation is terminated.
Mr. President, I move to open the period of committee amendments.
Period for committee amendments is in order.
There are no committee amendments. I move to close, Mr. President.
Period for committee amendments is terminated.
I move to open the period of individual amendments, Mr. President.
There are no individual amendments. I move to close, Mr. President.
So closed.
Mr. President, I move to approve this measure on second reading.
Any objection? Hearing none. House Bill 6003 under Committee Report 459 is approved on second reading.
I move to suspend consideration of this measure, Mr. President.
So suspended.
Mr. President, I move to resume consideration of House Bill number 6315 under Committee Report number 460.
In order.
I move to open the period of interpellation and to recognize Senator Osmeña, the sponsor.
Senator Osmeña is recognized.
There are no interpellations. I move to close, Mr. President.
So closed.
Mr. President, I move to open the period of committee amendments.
Committee amendments are in order.
There are no committee amendments. I move to close, Mr. President.
So closed.
Mr. President, I move to open the period of individual amendments.
There are no individual amendments. I move to close, Mr. President.
So closed.
Mr. President, I move to approve this measure on second reading.
Any objection? Hearing none. House Bill 6315 under Committee Report 460 is approved on second reading.
Mr. President, I move to suspend consideration of this measure.
So suspended.
Mr. President, I move to resume consideration of House Bill number 6313 under Committee Report number 461.
In order.
I move to open the period of interpellation and to recognize the sponsor, Senator Osmeña.
There are no interpellations. Thank you. I move to close, Mr. President.
So closed.
Mr. President, I move to open the period of committee amendments.
Senator
There are no
Osmeña.
committee amendments. I move to close, Mr. President.
So closed. Period for committee amendments.
I move to open the period of individual amendments, Mr. President.
There are no individual amendments. Move to close, Mr. President.
Period for individual amendments is terminated.
I move to approve this measure on second reading, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none. House Bill 6313 under Committee Report 461 is hereby approved on second reading.
I move to suspend consideration of this measure, Mr. President.
Consideration of the measure is suspended.
Mr. President, I move that we resume consideration of House Bill number 5942 under Committee Report number 470.
Consideration of the measure is in order.
Mr. President, I move to open the period of interpellation and to recognize the sponsor, Senator Sergio Osmeña.
Senator Osmeña is recognized.
There are no reservations to interpolate. I move to close, Mr. President.
Period for interpellation is terminated.
I move to open the period of committee amendments, Mr. President.
Committee amendments are in order.
There are no committee amendments. I move to close, Mr. President.
So closed.
Mr. President, I move to open the period of individual amendments.
Senator Osmeña.
There are no individual amendments. I move to close, Mr. President.
So closed.
Mr. President, I move to approve this measure on second reading.
Any objection? Hearing none. House Bill 5942 under Committee Report 470 is approved on second reading.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I move to suspend consideration of this measure.
So suspended. 1 minute suspension with the permission of the chamber. Oh, JB.
Mr. President, ready to resume, Mr. President.
Session is resumed.
Mr. President, we'll only be tackling one bill with Senator Pimentel. This is the Let me move to resume consideration of House Bill 3145 under Committee Report number 436. This is the proposed trial courts in Oriental Mindoro, Mr. President.
Consideration of House Bill 3145 under Committee Report 436 is in order.
Mr. President, I move to open the period of interpellation and to recognize Senator Pimentel.
Senator Pimentel is recognized.
There have been no reservations, Mr. President, for interpellation. So, with that manifestation, I move that we close the period for interpellations.
Period for interpellation is terminated.
Mr. President, I move to open the period of committee amendments.
Committee amendments are in order.
Can I ask for a minute suspension, Mr. President?
1 minute suspension. Hanggang saan ba tayo?
Okay, sir. Bababa na si Pat.
Okay, so. Okay. Kasi sir.
Ready to resume, Mr. President.
Session is resumed.
Mr. President, before we called for a suspension, we move to recognize Senator Pimentel for the period of interpellation.
Senator Pimentel, we are...
In the committee amendments, Mr. President.
I'm sorry, Mr. President. We are in the period of committee amendments.
We have on the floor House Bill 3145, just for the record. Is that correct?
Yes, yes, Mr. President.
All right, we are now in the period of committee amendments. The Senator Pimentel is recognized.
The committee report contains committee amendments, but if there is no objection, I move that I be allowed to withdraw the committee amendments and that they be deemed as not submitted, Mr. President.
So the committee amendments are deemed not submitted, and therefore the bill as originally filed will stand unless there are individual amendments. Is that the correct?
That's correct, Mr. President. I will be introducing individual amendments on the House bill, Mr. President.
All right. Any objection? Hearing none, The committee amendments proposed in the committee report are hereby withdrawn, and the original measure stands as it is as of this point.
I move to close the period of committee amendments, Mr.
So
President.
close.
I move to open the period of individual amendments,
The
Mr.
individual
President.
amendments are in order.
On page 1, section 1, line 2, I move that we move the phrase is hereby created after the word region. I so move, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none, approved.
On page 1, section 2, lines 4 to 7, extending to page 2, lines 1 to 2, I move that we delete the entire section 2 and we renumber accordingly the remaining sections of House Bill 3145. I so
Any
move, Mr.
objection?
President.
Hearing none, approved.
On page 2, section 3, lines on page 2 of the new section 3, lines 3 to 4. Wait, Mr. President. Okay, on page 2, section 3, the original section 3, lines 3 to 4, we delete the phrase respective branch numbers 4 and replace this with branch number of, and delete the words courts and replace this with the phrase regional trial court branch under this act. Hence, it will read as follows. This is now the new section 2, right? Section 2. This is now the new section 2. The Supreme Court shall assign the branch number of the newly created regional trial court branch under this act, period. I so move, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none, approved. Yung standard
Next is that on page 2, section 4, the original section 4, on line 7, there is the word courts, which is a plural apostrophe and apostrophe S. I move that we change this to courts, which is capital C-O-U-R-T apostrophe S, Mr. President.
All right.
I
Any
so move.
objection? Any objection? Hearing none, approved.
And still on that same section, I move that we delete the phrase the implementation of this act, period, as well as the following sentence, which reads as follows: the funding thereof shall likewise be included in the annual General Appropriations Act, and change this by inserting the following phrase: the operationalization of the newly created regional trial court branch under this act, comma, the funding of which shall be included in the annual General Appropriations Act, semicolon, provided that, comma, the funds necessary for its operation shall be appropriated and released only upon its actual organization and the appointment of its personnel, period. I so move, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none, approved.
Still on page 2, the original section 5, line 9, delete the comma only after 14E, the comma, and as well as the phrase 30 and 31, and on lines 11 to 12, delete the phrase as well as other provisions that may be inconsistent herewith is hereby deemed repealed, modified, and or further amended, and change this to and all other laws, comma, executive orders, comma, and rules and regulations which are inconsistent with this act are hereby amended, comma, repealed, comma, or modified accordingly, period. I so move, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none, approved.
And finally, to amend the title of the House Bill by changing the phrase an additional regional trial court branch to be stationed in Calapan City and an additional municipal trial court branch to be stationed in the municipality of Baco, all in the 1st District of Oriental Mindoro, comma, by changing this to an additional branch of the regional trial court with seat at Calapan City, comma, Oriental Mindoro in the 4th Judicial Region. Hence, the title will read as follows: an act creating an additional branch of the Regional Trial Court with seat at Calapan City, Oriental Mindoro, in the 4th Judicial Region, further amending for the purpose Batas Pambansa Bilang 129, otherwise known as the Judiciary Reorganization Act of 1980, as amended, and appropriating funds therefore. I so move, Mr. President.
Any objection here?
That would be all, Mr. President, for individual amendments. Can we approve for second reading? Approve on second reading.
Mr. President, I move to close the period of individual amendments.
So terminated.
Mr. President, I move to approve this measure on second reading.
Any objection? Hearing none. House Bill 3145 under Committee Report 436 is approved on second reading.
Mr. President, I move to suspend consideration of this measure.
So suspended.
Mr. President, I move that we transfer... Mr. President, 1 minute suspension, please.
1 minute suspension.
Ready to resume, Mr. President.
Session is resumed.
Mr. President, I move that we transfer Senate Bill 3210 under Committee Report number 467 from the calendar for ordinary business to the calendar for special orders.
Any objection? Hearing none. Senate Bill number 3210 is transferred from the calendar for special order business to the calendar for special orders.
Mr. President, I move that we consider Senate Bill number 3210 under Committee Report number 467.
Hold on. I'm sorry.
I move to consider Committee Report. I move to consider Senate Bill 3210 under Committee Report 467.
Consideration of the measure is in order.
Mr. President, I move that the Secretary read only the title of the measure.
The Secretary will read the title of the measure.
Senate Bill number 3210, an act integrating palliative and hospice care into the Philippine healthcare system.
Mr. President, I move that we recognize Senator Gingona to sponsor the measure.
Senator Gingona is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President, distinguished colleagues. Palliative and hospice care is a multidisciplinary care that improves the quality of life of terminally ill patients and their families. Palliative care, when first introduced in the country, mainly focused on cancer patients. Through the years, other components of palliative care were gradually practiced, leading to its recognition as a public health service. Acknowledging the call of the World Health Assembly, which recognized palliative care as a core component of integrated people-centered health services, this bill aims to integrate palliative and hospice care into the structure and finances of the Philippine healthcare system by 1. Strengthening and expanding human resources, including the training of existing health professionals, embedding palliative care into the core curricula of all new health professionals, as well as educating volunteers and the public. 2. Encouraging the development of home-based palliative and hospice care programs at the grassroots level, which would increase the poor's access to quality health service. 3. Directing PhilHealth to increase its present benefits package to include inpatient palliative services, outpatient hospice care, and home-based palliative care. In view of the foregoing, the passage of this bill is earnestly sought. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President, I move to suspend consideration of Senate Bill 3210 under Committee Report number 467.
Approved.
Mr. President, I move that we transfer Senate Bill number 3221 under Committee Report number 477 from the calendar for ordinary business to the calendar for special orders.
Any objection? Hearing none. Senate Bill 3221 is transferred from the calendar for ordinary business to the calendar for special orders.
Mr. President, I move that we consider Senate Bill 3221 under Committee Report number 477.
Consideration of the measure is in order.
I move that the Secretary read only the title of the measure, Mr.
The
President.
Secretary will read the title of the measure.
Senate Bill number 3221, an act strengthening the human organ tissue donation and transplantation program and providing penalties for violation, therefore amending for this purpose Republic Act number 7170 as amended, also known as the Organ Donation Act of 1991.
I move to recognize Senator Gingona, Mr. President.
Senator Gingona is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President, distinguished colleagues. It has been reported that human and tissue trading has become a lucrative business in the country for unscrupulous groups. Several documentaries have shown how residents in poor communities are lured into selling their organs in exchange for money. Such exploitation of the poor should be stopped. This measure seeks to establish the Philippine Organ and Tissue Donation and Transplantation Program, which will provide the overall direction and system of implementation of organ donation and transplantation in the country. Under the said program, there shall be centralized system of organ donors and patients registry to eliminate profit marketing of organ donation and to facilitate the success of organ transplants and the survival of patients. The Department of Health, together with the Department of Education and the CHED, are tasked to ensure that health professionals, media, students, among others, are informed and educated about the importance of organ donation. The bill further amends the Organ Donation Act of 1991 to cover organ and tissue donations for transplantation purposes from both deceased and living donors. While it allows living non-related donors, it upholds the World Health Organization guidelines and the Istanbul Declaration that prohibits incentives of value for valuable consideration for donors and their families. With the sanctions and penalties imposed on acts tantamount to trafficking or illicit marketing of human organs proposed in this bill, it is hoped that the inhumane organ trading will come to an end. In view of the foregoing, approval of this measure is sought.
Mr. President, I move to suspend consideration of this measure.
Consideration of the measure is suspended. Can the chair request for a 1-minute suspension?
In order.
Ready to resume, Mr. President.
Session is resumed.
Mr. President, I move that we transfer from the calendar for ordinary business to the calendar for special orders the following: Senate Bill number 2768 under Committee Report number 465, House Bill number 5852 under Committee Report number 473, and Senate Bill number 2915 under Committee Report number 474.
The aforementioned bills are transferred to the calendar for special orders.
Mr. President, I move that we consider on second reading under one omnibus sponsorship the measures I have enumerated as reported out under their respective committee reports.
Approved.
Mr. President, I move that the Secretary read only the titles of the proposed bills without prejudice to inserting into the record the whole text thereof.
Sorry, page.
Senate Bill 2768, an act upgrading the Amay Pakpak Medical Center in Marawi City, Lanao del Sur, and appropriating funds therefore. House Bill number 5852, an act upgrading the WAU District Hospital in the Municipality of WAU, Province of Lanao del Sur, and appropriating funds therefore, amending for the purpose Republic Act number 3607, entitled an act to provide for the establishment of one general hospital in each of the municipalities of Bayang, Tamparan, and Wao, all in the province of Lanao del Sur, and to authorize the appropriation of funds therefore. Senate Bill number 2915, an act upgrading the Southern Isabela General Hospital in Santiago City, province of Isabela, into a tertiary general hospital to be known as the Southern Isabela Medical Center, and appropriating funds therefore.
Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I move to recognize Senator Gingona.
Senator Gingona is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. These health bills propose to upgrade existing public hospitals. Through the years, these hospitals strive to improve their health care services. However, their present capabilities prevent them from serving the increasing number of patients and seeking medical services. These measures are in line with the goals of the Department of Health to enhance health facilities with the end in view of achieving universal health care. The approval of these measures are sought. Thank you.
Mr. President, before I move to suspend consideration, may I ask for a 1 minute suspension?
1 minute suspension.
Mr. President, I move to ready to resume, Mr. President.
Session is resumed.
Mr. President, I move to suspend consideration of Senate Bill numbers 2768, 2915, and House Bill number 5852.
So suspended.
Mr. President, I move that we transfer from the calendar for ordinary business to the calendar for special orders House Bill 1001 under Committee Report number 466 and Senate Bill number 2692 under Committee Report number 469.
So transferred.
I move that we consider on second reading under one omnibus sponsorship speech the measures I have enumerated, Mr. President.
In order.
Mr. President, I move that the Secretary read only the titles of the proposed bills without prejudice to inserting into the record the whole text thereof.
Secretary will do so.
House Bill number 1001, an act providing for the establishment of a district hospital in the municipality of Santa Elena, province of Camarines Norte, and appropriating funds therefore. Senate Bill number 2692, an act establishing the Soc-Sargent General Hospital in the municipality of Surala, province of the South Cotabato, and appropriating funds therefore.
Mr. President, the Minority Floor Leader.
The Minority Leader is recognized.
The second bill seems to be a local bill, Mr. President. Do we have a jurisdiction to do that?
These are the second bill, you mean?
Yes.
The Senate bill. The Majority Leader, what is the response? The question raised by the Minority Leader is that Senate Bill 2692 appears to be a bill of local application.
Where?
Mr. President, may I ask for a 1 minute suspension to confer with the
Suspension for 1 minute. Yeah, what? Huh? Why are we considering the Senate counterparty? Huh? Huh? Huh?
Santa Elena, Camarines Norte, and then Soc-Sargent.
Hindi, dapat 5433 ang pinonsider. Ang report out.
Bilis naman. Tama, sir. Ready to resume, Mr. President.
Session is resumed.
Mr. President, if I may respond to the inquiry of our esteemed Minority Floor Leader, he had pointed out that there is a Senate bill which should be a House bill because it is of local origin. So, because of that, Mr. President, I'm withdrawing that motion. And if I may repeat the motion to transfer from the calendar for ordinary business to the calendar for special orders, just House Bill number 1001, under Committee Report number 466.
What? 1001? Okay. In order.
Mr. President, I move that we consider on second reading the sponsorship speech of the measure I had enumerated.
There's only one measure being considered, House Bill 1001.
Yes, Mr. President.
So
I move that we consider this measure, Mr. President.
So considered.
Mr. President, I move that the Secretary read only the title of that bill without prejudice to inserting into the record the whole text of that bill.
Secretary will do so.
House Bill number 1001, an act providing for the establishment of a district hospital in the municipality of Santa Elena, province of Camarines Norte, and appropriating funds therefore.
Mr. President, I move that we recognize Senator Gingona to deliver his sponsorship speech over this measure.
Senator Gingona is recognized.
Yes, Mr. President. In the municipality of Santa Elena, Camarines Norte, only private clinics operate. They are small and far away from each other. The patients, as far as the municipalities of Calawag, Tagkayawan, and Labo, flock to Santa Elena to seek treatment. It would be a big disservice to the people if we do not provide them with access to a public hospital in the said municipality, Mr. President. In view of the foregoing, the urgent passage of this measure is earnestly sought.
Mr. President, I move to suspend consideration of House Bill number 1001 under Committee Report number 466.
So suspended.
Mr. President, I move that we transfer from the calendar for ordinary business to the calendar for special orders House Bill 5751 under Committee Report number 475 and House Bill number 5901 under Committee Report number 476.
In order.
Mr. President, I move that we consider on second reading under one omnibus sponsorship the measures I had enumerated.
The aforementioned bills will be sponsored under one omnibus sponsorship.
Mr. President, I move that the Secretary read only the title of those proposed bills without prejudice to inserting into the records the whole text thereof.
Secretary will do so.
House Bill number 5751, an act increasing the bed capacity of the Rosario District Hospital in the municipality of Rosario, province of La Union, from 25 to 50 beds and appropriating funds therefore. House Bill number 5901, an act increasing the bed capacity of the Governor Celestino Gallares Memorial Hospital in Tagbilaran City, province of Bohol, from 225 to 526 beds and appropriating funds therefore.
Mr. President, I move to recognize Senator Gingona to deliver his speech.
Senator Gingona is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. These bills propose to increase the bed capacity of existing public hospitals to be able to cater to the increasing health needs of the residents. These hospitals are operating beyond their 100% present bed capacities, which undermines the delivery of quality health care. In view of the foregoing, the urgent passage of this measure is earnestly sought. Thank you,
Majority
Mr.
Leader.
President.
Mr. President, I move to suspend consideration of this measure, of these measures.
Suspended.
Mr. President, I move that we transfer House Bill 5746 under Committee Report number 468 from the calendar for ordinary business to the calendar for special orders.
In objection, hearing none, in order.
Mr. President, I move that we consider House Bill 5746.
Consideration of the measure is in order.
I move that the Secretary read only the title of the measure.
The Secretary will do so.
House Bill number 5746, an act converting the Mayor Hilarion A. Ramiro, Sr. Regional Training and Teaching Hospital in the province of Misamis Occidental into a medical center to be known as the Mayor Hilarion A. Ramiro, Sr. Medical Center.
I move to recognize Senator Gingona, Mr. President.
Senator Gingona is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Mayor Hilarion A. Ramiro Sr. Regional Training and Teaching Hospital currently has an authorized bed capacity of 150 but its actual occupancy rate is 458 patients a day. It is about 300%. This hospital not only serves the province of Misamis Occidental, but also the neighboring provinces of Zamboanga del Sur, Lanao del Sur, Lanao del Norte, and the adjacent province of Zamboanga del Norte. This proposed conversion is in line with the thrust of the Department of Health to enhance health facilities and improve access to quality care. In view of the foregoing, the approval of this bill is earnestly sought.
Mr. President, I move to suspend consideration of House Bill 5746 under Committee Report number 468.
So suspended.
1 minute suspension, Mr. President.
1 minute suspension.
Ready to resume, Mr. President.
Session is resumed.
Mr. President, I move that we resume consideration of Senate Bill number 3086 under Committee Report number 352. This is the bill on the Department of Human Settlement and Urban Development, Mr. President.
Resumption of the consideration of the measure is in order.
Mr. President, the parliamentary status is that we are in the period of individual amendments. So may I move to recognize Senator J.V. Ejercito for his individual amendments.
Senator J.V. Ejercito is recognized. Ano to?
Okay, thank you, Mr. President. On page 2, lines 8 to 10, under section 3B, delete the whole definition of the word housing and replace it with the following. A multi-dimensional concept relating to the process of residing and the objects of dwelling, whose main attributes are location relative to access to livelihood, tenure arrangements, cost and physical structure, as well as their environment. Housing is likewise a physical structure as well as a social structure, functioning at different spatial scales, from homes, neighborhoods, communities, municipalities, cities, provinces, and regions. It is also a sector of the economy, an important category of land use in both urban and rural areas, especially in cities. And it is an important factor in the overall dynamics of the urban system. I so move, Mr. President.
Any objection? Approved.
On page 2, line 12, under section 3, paragraph C, subparagraph 1, insert a slash and the word dwelling. Section 3C shall read as, number 1, lot / dwelling without the consent of the owner. I so move, Mr. President.
Approved.
On page 2, line 16, under section 3, paragraph C, subparagraph 5, delete the open and close parentheses and the phrase APDs, if applicable, and replace it with as declared under Presidential Decree number 1967, series of 1980, if applicable. Section 3C 5 shall read as follows. Number 5, areas for priority development as declared under Presidential Decree number 1967, series of 1980, if applicable. I so move, Mr. President.
Approved.
On page 2, lines 18 to 22, under section 3, paragraph D, delete the whole definition and replace it with the following. The process that create a built environment with norms, institutions, and governance systems enabling individuals, households, and societies to maximize their potential, optimize a vast range of services so that homes and dynamic neighborhoods, cities and towns are planned, built, renewed, and consolidated, restraining adverse impacts on the environment, while safeguarding the quality of life, needs, and livelihood of its present and future population. I so move, Mr. President.
Approved.
On page 2, lines 23 to 25, under section 3, paragraph E, delete the whole definition of the word human settlement and replace it with the following. The totality of human community, whether tribe, village, town, or city, with all social, material, organizational, spiritual, and cultural elements that sustain it. The living environment must support the quality of life, including basic human needs of food, clothing, shelter, water supply, and sanitation, waste removal, healthcare, and primary education. I so move, Mr. President.
Approved.
On page 6, lines 14 to 15, under Section 8, Paragraph A, delete the phrase, the Bureau of Policies Coordination, Monitoring, Evaluation, and Programs, and replace it with operations. On the same page, lines 16 to 17, under Section 8, Paragraph B, delete the phrase, the Bureau of Environmental, Land Use, and Urban Planning Development, and replace it with Finance and Administration. On the same page, lines 18 to 19, delete the phrase, the Bureau of Regulation of Housing and Real Estate and Development, and replace it with Legal Services and Special Projects. On the same page, lines 20 to 21, delete the phrase, the Bureau of Homeowners, Homeowners Associations, and Community Development, and replace it with Plans and Programs. On the same page, line 25, last paragraph of Section 8, after the word Undersecretaries, insert the phrase, within the limits set by law and regulations. Section 8 shall read as the Undersecretaries, the Secretary shall be assisted by A, one Undersecretary for Operations, letter B, one Secretary for Finance and Administration, letter C, one Undersecretary for Legal Services and Special Projects, and D, one Undersecretary for Plans and Programs. They shall have the powers and functions as provided for in Section 10, Chapter 2, Book 4 of the Administrative Code of 1987. The Secretary is further authorized to delineate and assign the other functional areas of responsibility of the Undersecretaries within the limits set by law and regulations. I so move, Mr. President.
Approved.
On page 9, line 30, Section 20, after the word parties, insert the phrase, unless an appeal is perfected. I so move, Mr. President.
Approved.
On the same section, lines 7 to 8, delete the phrase, to the Court of Appeals by way of a petition for review. Still on the same section, line 9 thereof, delete the phrase, pursuant to Rule 43 of the Rules of Court, and insert the phrase, in accordance with the Rules of Court. Last paragraph of Section 25 now reads, decision of the HSAC can be appealed within 15 calendar days from notice of judgment, award, or order sought to be appealed, in accordance with the Rules of Court. I so move, Mr. President.
Approved.
On page 11, Section 27, line 17 to 19 thereof, delete the phrase, arising from, in connection with the implementation of pertinent laws on housing and on just and humane eviction and demolition procedures, and insert the phrase, upon the effectivity of this act, jurisdiction over which is transferred to the Commission by virtue hereof. To read as follows. Section 27, pending cases. All cases pending in regular courts upon the effectivity of this act, jurisdiction over which is transferred to the Commission by virtue hereof, shall continue to be heard, tried, and decided to their finality by such courts. I so move, Mr. President.
Approved.
Mr. President, that's all for my individual amendments.
All right. Any other colleague, member of the Senate, of the Chamber, who would have individual amendments?
Mr. President, I just want to manifest that I will make my individual amendment when we come back this May, because I have to have the clean copy of the final bill.
Yes, and given the extensive individual amendments proposed by the sponsor, in fairness, we would want to allow our other colleagues to study these individual amendments and maybe raise questions for clarification when we come back after the session.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Mr. President, I move to suspend consideration of this measure.
So suspended, with the Secretariat is directed to have a clean copy of this measure.
Mr. President, I move to proceed with the additional reference of business.
1 minute suspension. Abutan tayo ng siyam-siyam. Wag na. Wala namang mangyayari dyan. All right, session is resumed. The Secretary is directed to read the additional reference of business.
Resolutions, proposed Senate Resolution number 1727, resolution directing the appropriate Senate committee to conduct an inquiry in aid of legislation on the status of the reported 23 million pesos that was raised supposedly to serve as blood money to save the life of Joselito Zapanta, an overseas Filipino worker convicted for a felony and who eventually received the death penalty in Saudi Arabia, with the end in view of adopting the necessary strategies, policies, and measures and undertaking concerted efforts to save OFWs on death row under justifiable circumstances, including the matter of raising blood money, its allocation to pay the victims, as well as the possible utilization thereof for other worthy programs in the event it could not be used anymore for the purpose for which it was intended, introduced by Senator Cynthia A. Villar.
Committee on Labor, Employment, and Human Resource Development and Foreign Relations.
Committee reports.
1728.
PS Resolution number 1728, resolution expressing support to the development of the Clark International Airport in Pampanga under a four-pronged approach and urging in the process the appropriate committees of the Senate to look into the matter with the end in view of enacting legislative measures to address the same, introduced by Senators Grace Poe and Escudero.
Public Services, Ways and Means.
1729, a resolution directing the appropriate Senate committees to conduct an inquiry in aid of legislation on the livelihood and enterprise development programs of government agencies for the purpose of enabling closer coordination and convergence towards more efficient service and support for the Philippine enterprises, by Senator Paulo Benigno Bam Aquino IV.
Committee on Trade, Commerce, and Entrepreneurship, Local Government.
1730, a resolution directing the appropriate Senate committees to conduct an inquiry in aid of legislation on the implementation of the BMBA Act of 2002 in support of micro-enterprises in the Philippines, by Senator Paulo Benigno Bam Aquino IV.
Trade, Commerce, and Entrepreneurship, Local Government.
1731, a resolution directing the appropriate Senate committees to conduct an inquiry in aid of legislation on government's effectiveness in promoting access to responsive financing for micro, small, and medium enterprises, Senator Paulo Benigno Bam Aquino IV.
Committees on Trade, Commerce, Entrepreneurship, Banks, Financial Institutions, and Currencies.
Committee report 499, prepared and submitted jointly by the Committees on Health and Demography, Education, Arts and Culture, Finance, Youth, Women, Children, Family Relations, and Gender Equality, and Justice and Human Rights on Senate Bill number 3223, with Senators Cayetano P., Defensor Santiago, Ercito Estrada, Joseph Victor Ercito Trillanes IV, Grace Poe, Marian Lourdes Nancy S. Binay, Lapid, Gingona III, Ligarda, Paulo Benigno Bam Aquino IV, and Pimentel III as authors thereof, entitled An Act Strengthening the Philippine Comprehensive Policy on HIV and AIDS Prevention, Treatment, Care, and Support, repealing for the purpose Republic Act No. 8504, otherwise known as the Philippine AIDS Prevention and Control Act of 1998, and appropriating funds therefore, recommend its approval, and substitution of Senate Bill numbers 1481, 86879, 1100, 1178, 1217, 2546, 2728, 2827, and 3054, and resolutions numbers 83247, 423, 48372, 41050, 1104, 1373, and 1664, and taking into consideration House Bill number 5178. Sponsors Senators Cayetano P. and Gingona III.
To the calendar for ordinary business.
500, submitted jointly by the Committees on Education, Arts and Culture, Health and Demography, Finance and Ways and Means on Senate Bill number 2948, introduced by Senator Cayetano Pia, entitled An Act Establishing a National Vision Screening Program for Kindergarten Pupils and appropriating funds, therefore, recommend its approval with amendments, sponsored Senator Cayetano P. 501, submitted jointly by the Committees on Education, Arts and Culture, and Finance on House Bill number 4366, by Representative Puno et al., an act establishing a National Science and Technology High School in Barangay San Jose, City of Antipolo, Province of Rizal, to be known as Antipolo City National Science and Technology High School, and appropriating funds therefore, recommending its approval without amendment, sponsor Senator Cayetano P.
To the calendar for ordinary business.
Mr. President, with the consent of the Senate, I move that we transfer Senate Bill number 3223 under Committee Report number 499 from the calendar for ordinary business to the calendar for special orders.
So So transferred.
Mr. President, I move to consider Senate Bill number 3223 under Committee Report number 499.
Consideration of the measure on second reading is in order.
I move that the Secretary read only the title of the measure.
Secretary will read the title of the measure.
Senate number 3223, an act strengthening the Philippine Comprehensive Policy on HIV and AIDS prevention, treatment, care, and support, repealing for the purpose RA number 8504, otherwise known as the Philippine AIDS Prevention and Control Act of 1998, and appropriating funds therefore.
Mr. President, I move to recognize Senator Pia Cayetano.
Senator Pia Cayetano is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, this bill aims to strengthen our response to the HIV/AIDS epidemic, not only to reach the global goals, but more importantly, to protect and promote the health of our citizens. I ask that my speech be read into the records, Mr. President.
All right. The Secretary is directed to reflect into the record the sponsorship speech which Senator Cayetano is now submitting to the Secretary, to the Chamber.
Mr. President, I move to suspend consideration of Senate Bill number 3223 under Committee Report
So
499.
suspended.
Mr. President, I move to transfer Senate Bill 2948 under Committee Report number 500 from the calendar for ordinary business to the calendar for special orders.
So transferred.
I move that we consider Senate Bill number 2948.
Consideration of the measure is in order.
I move that the Secretary read only the title of the measure.
Secretary will do so.
Senate number 2948, an act establishing a national vision screening program for kindergarten pupils and appropriating funds therefore.
I move to recognize Senator Pia Cayetano, Mr. President.
Senator Pia Cayetano is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, this measure seeks to establish the National Vision Screening Program, which will screen the eye vision of kindergarten pupils to identify early childhood visual problems. I ask that my speech be read into the records, Mr. President.
The sponsorship speech is deemed read into the record.
Mr. President, I move to suspend consideration of Senate Bill number 2948.
Consideration of the measure is suspended.
Mr. President, I move to transfer House Bill number 4366 under 1 minute suspension, Mr. President.
Suspended.
House Bill.
Mr. President, ready to resume.
Ready to session resume.
Mr. President, I move to transfer House Bill number 4366 under Committee Report number 501 from the calendar for ordinary business to the calendar for special orders.
So transferred.
I move to consider House Bill number 4366, Mr. President.
Consideration of the measure is in order.
I move that the Secretary read only the title of the measure.
Secretary will read the title of the measure.
House number 4366, an act establishing a National Science and Technology High School in Barangay San Jose, City of Antipolo, Province of Rizal, to be known as Antipolo City National Science and Technology High School, and appropriating funds therefore.
I move to recognize Senator Pia Cayetano, Mr. President.
Senator Pia Cayetano is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. This bill will establish a separate school with a focus on science and technology, and the DepEd has given its positive recommendation. I move that my speech be read into the records, Mr. President.
The Secretary is directed to reflect into the record the sponsorship speech of Senator Pia Cayetano.
Mr. President, I move to suspend consideration of this measure.
So suspended.
Mr. President, I move to adjourn the session until 3 o'clock in the afternoon of Monday, May 23, 2016.
Any objection? Hearing none, this session is adjourned until 3 o'clock in the afternoon of May 23, 2016.